years ago, I made my first, and I'll admit long overdue, trip to Athens. I was really excited to finally see the Parthenon, and, albeit a bit smaller than I'd expected, it was truly a marvel to look at. But the next day, during my visit to the Museum of the Ancient Agora, I saw a banner that took me by surprise. It was related to the battles between the ancient Greeks and the achaemenid Persians. On it read, I quote, "The victorious outcome of the battles of the Greeks against the Persians marks the supremacy of the values of freedom and democracy against the unfree despotism." End quote. How true is this statement? I'm Madam Archaeologist, your go-to informant on everything archaeology, and in this episode, I'll give a critical review of the evidence and show you that history isn't really this black and white. Before moving forward, let's unpack some keywords here. Despotism, for one, is a word loaded with negative connotations. It refers to the exercise of absolute power in a cruel, tyrannical, and oppressive way. Now, originally, the ancient Greek word despotes didn't carry these negative connotations. It simply referred to a master or lord, someone with authority over others. Over time, negative connotations started to be added, associating the term despot with tyranny. Ancient Greek writers wrote about the Persian emperors as absolute rulers and often, not always but often, portrayed them as having exercised that power in a tyrannical and oppressive way, which is consistent with the use of the term despot as we know it today. The Persian emperors did rule as absolute monarchs, that is true, but this doesn't necessarily mean that they were tyrannical. And one thing in the quote from the banner that shows complete ignorance on the part of the writer is the use of the keyword free to describe ancient Athens and unfree to describe ancient Persia. When we compare life under the two states, and I'll get to the evidence shortly, we see that such a black and white distinction doesn't really sum the picture up well. Now, democracy is a form of government which means rule by the people. It comes from the Greek word demos, meaning people, and krato, meaning rule. In a democracy, the majority makes the decisions. And that's it, it's as simple as that. When you start adding values like freedom to it, like in the banner, then it becomes an ideology. Now, I'll make it very clear that I don't intend this video to be an attack on democracy, and I find both the ancient Greek and Persian civilizations absolutely fascinating. My intention here is simply to show you how history should never be seen from just one perspective. I want to critically assess this statement in this banner. Was it really the case that classical Athens was free and Persia was unfree? Let's take a look at ancient Athens first. The reasons behind the development of democracy starting in the late 6th century BC is partially clouded in mystery. We know that the last so-called tyrant to rule Athens fled the city in 510 BC following an invasion led by Sparta, another Greek city-state. After that, an Athenian aristocrat named Cleisthenes promoted democratic reforms that were further developed over subsequent decades, culminating in a direct democracy where Athenian citizens were directly involved in governing and lawmaking. Now, it wasn't that everybody voted and made decisions at the same time, rather, eligible citizens performed their political duties in batches. Three crucial institutions made up the direct democracy of classical Athens. The assembly, referred to as the ecclesia in Greek, was in charge of writing laws, amongst other things. Assembly meetings were held several times a year, and every eligible citizen could attend those meetings and make decisions through majority vote. Meanwhile, each year 500 citizens were selected to serve on the Council of 500. The Council of 500, known as the Boule in Greek, was a smaller body that met every day for the daily governance work. It was composed of representatives chosen by lot, and the representatives would change frequently, so every citizen had a chance to partake in government decisions. There were 10 tribes, and each had 50 representatives at the Boule. In this sense, ancient Athenian democracy was quite different from the democracies that many of us are familiar with today, where the people elect representatives to make decisions. There was also the dicasteria, the popular court, where cases would be heard before a jury, also chosen by lot. Anyways, democracy lasted in Athens until 322 BC, when the city lost in battle against Macedonia, with two exceptions when democracy was very briefly interrupted between 411 to 410 and 404 to 43 BC. Let's ask an important question. who exactly was a citizen in Athens in the 5th and 4th centuries BC? This question is complicated by the fact that the concept of citizenship in classical Athens differs from our definition of it today. When we think of a citizen of a democratic country, we think of someone who has the right to vote. In Athens, not everyone who was considered a citizen had the right to vote. So, a better question might be, who had the full rights of citizenship in classical Athens? The answer is free Athenian men. This initially meant being born to a free Athenian father, but the law was later changed in 451 or 450 BC so that Athenian citizenship was only granted to a son who was born to both an Athenian father and an Athenian mother. Women were not granted the full rights of citizenship and were completely excluded from political affairs. They were instead largely bound to the house. This has heavily impacted on modern scholarship relating to women's rights in classical Athens, so much so that you'll find papers stating that Athenian women weren't really citizens at all. If we go by our modern definition of a citizen, then sure, they certainly weren't citizens. But looking at citizenship in classical Athens from our perspective doesn't really give us a well-rounded picture, because although they couldn't enjoy all the privileges that came with citizenship, women who were Athenian citizens still had some privileges that non-citizens didn't have, such as the right to inherit Athenian property, even if to a limited extent, the privilege to play important roles in religious festivals, and after 451 or 450 BC, the right to marry an Athenian man. However, women did live quite restricted lives in comparison to Athenian men. Women would spend most of the time inside the house, and their main activities consisted of running the household, spinning, and weaving fabric. But I will note that women weren't completely passive figures in ancient Athenian society. When a woman married, depending on her social class, she'd bring a dowry, which usually consisted of money and perhaps valuable things like furniture. And, although this is debated, the dowry belonged to her and she had a large degree of control over it. In the event of divorce, the woman would take her dowry back to her father's household with her. So, if a woman brought a large dowry to her marriage, she could find herself having the upper hand in that marriage, because she could always threaten her husband with divorce. That said, it is still a fact that women were not allowed to partake in government affairs. They didn't spend nearly as much time in the public outdoors as their male counterparts did, and they lacked individual autonomy. Socially, a married woman was addressed as the wife of her husband, while an unmarried woman as her father's daughter. Now, you've probably heard of the famous philosopher Socrates. I'm personally a big fan of his teachings, and he has greatly influenced Western philosophy, but that's beyond the scope of this video. Now, it was Athens' democracy that sentenced him to death because, put plainly, he said and did stuff that other citizens simply didn't like. Socrates' trial was held in 399 BC by an Athenian jury, and his official execution was ordered on the grounds of impiety and corrupting the youth. One source where we get details on his trial is Plato's Apology, which in this context is actually a defense. A man named Meletus formally accused Socrates of those two things listed above, and so the 70-year-old philosopher was brought before a jury. What exactly sparked these accusations? Socrates gained many haters because he'd go around Athens, approach citizens, question them, and then reveal the biases, contradictions, and ignorance within each person through the answers they'd give him, showing each person who claimed to know something that they knew only very little or in fact nothing. When your own values are being thrown into question and your biases revealed, you are more likely to feel uncomfortable and intimidated than to take a critical look at yourself. It takes an exceptional character to be able to do that, so it's not a surprise that Socrates made enemies here and there. However, this method sparked curiosity amongst younger Athenians, who would follow Socrates around and imitate his method of questioning. It is for this reason mainly that Socrates was accused of corrupting the youth. As for impiety, Meletus accused Socrates of not recognizing the city's gods and that he was instead introducing new deities. Socrates, as expected, defended himself at his trial. For example, he believed that contrary to corrupting the youth, he had instead helped them on the path to greater wisdom. After his speech, Socrates offered to pay a fine, but in the end, the jury voted in favor of execution. This is a famous story, and such an important one, because we gain insights into the value of ancient Athenian society at that time. Clearly, there wasn't much freedom of speech, nor religious freedom. For those who voted in favor of Socrates' execution, I don't know what the real reason behind each person's decision to do so was, but many of us can agree that Socrates' execution was extreme and it doesn't fit the image of democracy as a free society. So much for the freedom part in the supremacy of the values of freedom and democracy. Persia, on the other hand, is known for its tolerance. All conquered subjects could practice their religions freely and keep their local customs and traditions. Cyrus the Great founded the Persian Empire in 550 BC, just a few decades before democracy began developing in Athens, and it lasted for over 200 years until Alexander the Great's conquest in 330 BC. In 539 BC, Cyrus the Great conquered Babylon, freed the Jews, and restored their temples. Part of this event is recounted in the famous Cyrus Cylinder, and part of it is told in the Bible, where Cyrus is held in high regard. The Cyrus Cylinder is a very special artifact because it's considered the first charter of human rights. Why? Because Cyrus declared that there should be freedom of choice with regards to religion. He promoted racial equality and he freed slaves. To top things off, Cyrus doesn't say that it was his Zoroastrian god. Zoroastrianism was the official religion of the Persian Empire. Anyways, this Zoroastrian god wasn't the one that gave him permission to conquer Babylon, but rather it was the local Babylonian deity Marduk, adding even more support to the image of a respectful and tolerant emperor. Bas-reliefs at the former ceremonial capital of Persepolis, known in Persian as Takht-i-Jamshid, also provide material evidence for this attitude of tolerance. Construction on Persepolis started at the height of the Persian Empire's power, under Darius the Great, who reigned from 522 to 486 BC. Here, the bas-reliefs depict Persia's multi-ethnic subjects bringing the king gifts as tribute, led peacefully by courtiers. We see Medes, Elamites, Thracians, Sagartians, Bactrians, Egyptians, although these reliefs are unfortunately very damaged, Aryans, Parthians, Carians, Arabs, Sogdians, Gandharans, Saki, Syrians, Babylonians, Armenians, Libyans, Nubians, Indians, Aracosians, Greeks, Cappadocians, and Lydians. These reliefs don't just show the extent of the Persian king's power. That wasn't really the main purpose. If the purpose of these reliefs was to show power, that the Persian king ruled over all these nations, then going with a picture of the Persians defeating these nations would have sufficed and probably done a better job. Instead, King Darius chose to show a peaceful procession where his subjects are being brought before him by courtiers. Persepolis was the place where the king would receive his subjects, and he wanted them to feel welcome. We even see his courtiers holding hands with the first delegate of these subject nations. What we really see in these reliefs is a scene of mutual respect between the king and his subjects, and I find it a very interesting choice, certainly advanced for its time. I also find it very interesting that a similar theme shows up on the tombs of many of the Persian rulers, specifically the rock-cut tombs belonging to both early and later Persian emperors. We have Darius I, Xerxes I, Artaxerxes I, Darius II, Artaxerxes II, and Artaxerxes III. The tombs of Darius I, Darius II, Xerxes I, and Artaxerxes I are at the royal achaemenid necropolis of Nakhshe-Rostam, while Artaxerxes II and III are buried at Persepolis, although their tombs were modeled on those at Nakhshe-Rostam. What we see on the outside of all these rock-cut tombs is the depiction of soldiers, and they each represent a person from a different ethnicity within the empire. This is very interesting to me because it shows respect on behalf of the emperors for their multi-ethnic subjects. Persia wasn't a melting pot. Everybody who was conquered became a welcomed and respected subject. The Persian Empire was essentially a multicultural, multi-faith, and multilingual empire. But what about the Behistun Inscription, you may ask, where Darius discusses the revolts that took place across his empire in the first year of his reign and how he successfully defeated his enemies, punishing them through mutilation and execution. At first, this may seem like despotic behavior, but it's important to consider 1. What is said in the inscription, and 2. Its purpose. I'll quote an important section, translated obviously. On this account, Ahura Mazda brought me help, and all the other gods, all that there are, because I was not wicked, nor was I a liar, nor was I a despot. Neither I nor any of my family. I have ruled according to righteousness. Neither to the weak nor the powerful did I do wrong. Whosoever helped my house, I favored. He who was hostile, him I destroyed. End quote. There are two purposes we can point out here. One, Darius was legitimizing his rule by associating himself with the divine and saying that all his actions stemmed not from evil but from divine support. Two, what he says about defeating his enemies isn't anything abnormal. When you rule over a territory as vast as the Persian Empire, it was the largest empire the world had seen up to that time, and Darius ruled over it at its territorial height. You need to exert power and instill a certain level of fear in your enemies to keep things in order. Also, if we take it that these events actually took place and were not just exaggerated to make Darius appear to be a powerful emperor, then we must point out the fact that he did not act unprovoked. Darius didn't just punish anybody, only those who committed an act of high treason, and it's normal in any society for such actions to be followed by severe punishments. Darius was committed to a policy of tolerance towards his subjects, as we see in the Persepolis bas-reliefs, but he also had to make sure that he kept any potential usurpers in check, as any powerful ruler had to do. Now let's take a look at an emperor that ancient Greek writers painted in one of the worst possible lights, Cambyses II, also known as Cambyses the Great. Cambyses was the son of Cyrus the Great, and one of the things he's famous for is his conquest of Egypt, which took place in 525 BC. Our ancient Greek sources paint him as the epitome of cruelty and a total madman. Herodotus in particular, even though he wrote more than a century after Cambyses' reign, claimed that Cambyses had mocked the Egyptians and their sacred Apis bull, and that he'd slaughtered this bull that was so important to the ancient Egyptians. This would contradict our general picture of tolerant rulers. But archaeological discoveries have proven Herodotus wrong. The Apis bull was worshipped in Egypt as the manifestation of the god Ptah, who was associated with death and rebirth. Apis bulls were considered sacred, so they got to live in a special temple, and when one Apis bull died, it was buried with the proper rituals and then replaced by another bull, believed to carry on Ptah's spirit. A sarcophagus found in the Serapeum at Saqqara, the building dedicated to the burial of Apis bulls, was actually dedicated by Cambyses to the Apis bull, a sort of gift from the emperor. A part of the inscription on it states that Cambyses has made a fine monument for his father Apis Osiris with a great granite sarcophagus, dedicated by the king of Upper and Lower Egypt, Mesotira, son of Ra, Cambyses. End quote. This, in fact, shows Cambyses embracing and respecting ancient Egyptian religious traditions. There's also a commemorative stela related to the cult of the Apis bull, with a carving showing Cambyses kneeling before the bull. Plus, in his inscriptions, Cambyses refers to himself as the king of Upper and Lower Egypt, meaning that he honored a very ancient tradition of Egyptian pharaohs referring to themselves as such. He even took an Egyptian throne name, Mesotira, to follow the Egyptian customs of royal titulary, where one name refers to the ruler's birth name and the other one is his throne name. He also mentioned important Egyptian gods, again showing respect for local religious traditions. Also in achaemenid Persia, and it's really rare to be able to say this about past civilizations and societies, but women were equal to men. Both women and men had individual autonomy, and both genders enjoyed social and personal freedoms. Women throughout the Persian Empire were allowed to own property and could have their job of choice. Many ran their own businesses, supervised male and female subordinates at work, and some even held high-ranking positions in the military. One woman I'd like you to meet is Irdabama. Irdabama was a very successful businesswoman, and we know a lot about her through tablets found at Persepolis. She produced wine and grain and owned estates in different parts of the empire. She hired her own business personnel and was the manager of various workforces, the largest of which was of a considerable size of 480 laborers, both women and men. Irdabama traveled from estate to estate to conduct her businesses, and she even had her own seal to authenticate documents. It's possible that Irdabama was the mother of Darius the Great, although this is debated and we don't know much about her early life. However, her success implies that she came from a high-status family. And this is just one example of the many women who contribute to the everyday running of the empire. Women held positions from managers to clerks and worked jobs from laborers to artisans, amongst others. We even have tablets from Persepolis showing that both men and women were involved in the palace's construction, and workers of both genders received wages. Meanwhile, at the same time, women in Athens were expected to spend most of their time at home. Ancient Athenian women lived quite restricted lives in comparison to women living in the Persian Empire. A point I'd like to end on is that there were also lots of cultural interactions between the Persians and the Greeks. The Greeks had no problem imitating styles from Persia and the East, particularly with regards to clothing and artwork. Through spoils of war, many Athenians from the classical period became familiarized with Persian material culture. although some Athenians would have become acquainted with Persian goods and styles through trade and diplomatic relations as well. Let's look at some examples of how these interactions influenced Athenian culture. Here are two examples of a Persian raiton, a special type of drinking cup. After the Battle of Plataea, we see ceramic imitations by Athenian potters. They don't look exactly the same as the Persian ones, but that's part of the point. When cultures interact and share ideas, the cultures taking those ideas in are free to add their own twist to it. That is what the Greeks did with the raiton. There was also this Persianization, we could say, of the way that Greek mythological scenes were painted on pots. Here we have an Attic pot from about 440 BC that was shipped to Italy, and we see Midas enthroned in a very Persian manner. We can even see Persian influence on Athenian architecture. The Odeon of Pericles, for example, is said to have copied the Persians. Plutarch, in his Life of Pericles, tells us, I quote, "The Odeum, which was arranged internally with many tiers of seats and many pillars, and which had a roof made with a circular slope from a single peak, they say was an exact reproduction of the great king's pavilion, and this too was built under the superintendence of Pericles." End quote. Excavations further revealed that the Odeon's dimensions were very similar to the hall of 100 columns at Persepolis, and its columns were organized in rows of 9 by 10, while the hall's columns were organized in rows of 10 by 10. What can we establish from all of this? Well, it looks like the Greeks hated the Persians in writing, but in practice, they admired them to at least a certain degree, or enough to incorporate pieces of Persian culture into their own. Ancient Greece and Persia were no doubt two of the greatest civilizations, and both contributed much to our modern world. This is just an example of how history should never be solely studied from one perspective, and it certainly shouldn't be seen as a black and white picture. When we analyze the evidence from ancient Athens and Persia, we see that it wasn't really the case that one society was free and the other unfree. In many cases, people in ancient Persia had more freedoms than ancient Athenians. Don't forget to give this video a like and subscribe for more cool content by your go-to informant on everything archaeology, Madam Archaeologist.